They called her the Shattered Rose of House Valerus. Once, Lady Elara had been the centerpiece of her father's court, her laughter like wind chimes in the cold stone halls, her grace on horseback the envy of every knight and nobleman. But memory is a tapestry woven with threads of silk and thorns, and Elara's was now mostly thorns. A wild gallop, a startled steed, a fall that had stolen the life from her legs had transformed her from a prized bloom into a weed to be plucked. Her father, Lord Valerus, a man whose heart was forged from the same cold iron as his ambition, saw her now not as a daughter, but as a flaw in his lineage, a stain upon the perfect portrait of power he wished to project. The court that had once sung her praises now whispered behind gloved hands, their pity a crueler weapon than any sword. She was a beautiful, broken thing, kept in the castle's finest room like a porcelain doll with cracked limbs, a constant, silent reminder of imperfection. The day of her final degradation dawned with a sky the color of a bruise. Lord Valerus had been entertaining a delegation of wine merchants from the south, his voice booming through the great hall for 3 days, fueled by the very vintages they sought to sell him. He had made a decision. His daughter's stagnant presence was a political liability, an obstacle to a new alliance he wished to forge with a neighboring lord whose own daughter was robust and whole. Elara was to be excised. He had her carried down to the courtyard, her useless legs draped in velvet as if to mock their stillness, and placed in a high-backed chair before the assembled merchants and his own leering court. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and humiliation. Her father, his face flushed with wine and authority, gestured to her with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "A fine vintage requires cellar space," he declared, his words slurring only slightly. "I am clearing my cellars of that which has soured." He looked at the chief merchant, a portly man with eyes like polished stones. "Your finest shipment of Shadow Peak red for a decade, and you may take this ornament with you. Use her as a serving girl. A book reader. I care not. She is yours." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, a sound of shock that quickly morphed into the shuffling of feet and averted eyes. Elara felt the world dissolve into a roaring in her ears. She was not being married off or sent to a nunnery, she was being bartered, like livestock or old furniture, traded for casks of dark red wine. In the back of the assembled crowd, a man stood motionless, his presence a stark contrast to the shifting, uncomfortable courtiers. He was not of their world. His hands were calloused, his shoulders broad from a life of labor, and a fine layer of soot seemed permanently etched into the lines of his face. This was Cale, the town blacksmith, who had come to the castle only to deliver a newly forged gate latch. He was a man acquainted with silence and sorrow. The forge was his sanctuary, the clang of hammer on steel his only conversation since his wife, Anya, had been taken by a fever 2 winters past. Her death had stolen more than his joy, it had stolen his daughter's voice. Little Lyra, who had witnessed her mother's last breath, had not spoken a word since. Now, Cale watched as the noble lord disowned his own child with less ceremony than one might discard a stray dog. He saw the merchant's greedy eyes appraise the Lady Elara, not with lust, but with the cold calculation of a man assessing an exotic, if damaged, commodity. And in Elara's face, beneath the veil of shock, he saw a flicker of the same profound loss that resided in his own heart. It was a silent kinship of the broken. The merchant grunted his assent, already imagining the novelty of a highborn serving wench. He gestured for 2 of his brutish guards to fetch his new property. But as they moved forward, Cale stepped out from the shadows. His voice, rough from disuse and furnace smoke, cut through the tense air. "My lord," he said, his gaze fixed not on Valerus, but on the merchant. "This is no fair trade." Lord Valerus turned, his eyes narrowing at the commoner's audacity. "And what would a smith know of fair trade?" he sneered. Cale ignored him, his focus unwavering. "I will offer a better price," he said to the merchant. He unstrapped a heavy, all-cloth-wrapped bundle from his back. He laid it on the cobblestones and unfolded it. Inside was a set of fireplace tools, a poker, tongs, and a shovel, but they were unlike any a common hearth had ever seen. The iron had been worked into the shape of climbing ivy, each leaf perfectly rendered, each fine twisting with an impossible, organic grace. At the top of the poker, a single, perfect iron rose bloomed. It was a masterpiece, the last project he and Anya had designed together, a thing of beauty he had sworn never to part with. This, Cale said, his voice thick with emotion, for the lady. The merchant's eyes widened, recognizing the peerless craftsmanship, worth more than a cellar of wine. He looked from the tools to the crippled girl, then back again. He nodded. The deal was struck. Lord Valerus, baffled but eager to be rid of his daughter, merely shrugged and stalked back toward his hall. Cale had not bought a servant, he had rescued a soul. Cale approached Ilara's chair. He expected fear, or perhaps the haughty disdain of a noblewoman forced to deal with a commoner. Instead, he saw nothing but a vast, empty landscape of shock in her pale blue eyes. He knelt, his knees cracking on the cold stone, bringing him to her level. "My lady," he said softly, the title a deliberate act of respect. "I mean you no harm. My home is humble, but it is safe." He moved to lift her, his movement slow and deliberate. As his strong, warm arms slid beneath her, one under her knees and the other supporting her back, she flinched, a lifetime of noble propriety screaming at the impropriety of this touch. But there was no cruelty in it, no sense of ownership. It was a hold of pure, practical support, as careful as if he were lifting a piece of delicate, heated glass. He carried her out of the courtyard, away from the stone walls that had become her prison, and through the town. The transition was a sensory assault. The castle's cold, echoing silence was replaced by the clatter of carts, the shouting of vendors, and the rich, earthy smells of wood smoke, baking bread, and manure. She buried her face in the rough wool of his tunic, the unfamiliar scent of coal dust, sweat, and clean iron filling her senses. It was the scent of a world she had only ever looked down upon, a world that was now her own. The smithy was attached to a small, two-room cottage. The front room was a cavern of shadows and firelight, dominated by the great stone forge and the anvil that was its altar. The air was thick with the metallic tang of cooling iron and the bite of coal smoke. It was a place of raw, masculine power, and Ilara felt a tremor of fear. But Cale carried her past the forge, through a door into the living quarters. The space was small and sparse, but it was clean, and a pot of something savory bubbled over a small hearth, filling the air with the scent of herbs and stewed barley. A small, silent child with wide, dark eyes, Anya's eyes, peered out from behind a wooden chair, her expression one of solemn curiosity. This was Lyra. Cale took Ilara to the only other room, a small chamber with a simple bed, a wooden chest, and a single, small window. The room was cool and smelled faintly of dried lavender. This is the best room," he said, his voice stumbling slightly. "It is yours." He gently placed her on the bed, the mattress filled with straw and feathers, a world away from her goose-down billows. He laid a thick, woven blanket over her legs and then stood back, his hands clasped awkwardly, a mountain of a man suddenly adrift in a sea of unspoken things. That evening, after a simple meal of stew and coarse bread eaten in near silence, Cale finally spoke of his purpose. He did not sit near her, but stood by the hearth, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "My lady," he began, his gaze on the fire. "I did not purchase you for labor. I have no need of a servant." Ilara stared at him, confusion warring with the profound weariness in her bones. "Then why?" she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. He turned to look at her then, and she saw the deep well of grief in his eyes. "My daughter, Lyra," he said, his voice cracking. "She has not spoken since her mother died. She has locked herself away in a world of silence. The healers can do nothing." He gestured vaguely toward a small stack of books on a shelf, treasures in a commoner's home. "But she is bright. She watches everything. I see the intelligence in her eyes. You are a lady. You are educated. You can read and write, and you know of things beyond this village." He took a breath, the confession costing him dearly. "I hoped, perhaps you could teach her. Give her a key to unlock the world. A reason to speak to it again." The revelation settled over Ilara, stunning her. He hadn't seen a cripple. He hadn't seen a disgraced noblewoman or a bargain to be had. He had seen a mind. He had looked past her broken body and seen a part of her she thought had died with her freedom, her purpose. For the first time since her fall, a flicker of something other than despair ignited within her. It was the fragile, unfamiliar spark of being needed. The lessons began the next day. Cale fashioned a small slate and gave Ilara a piece of chalk. Lyra was hesitant at first, the wild little fawn, all sharp angles and watchful silence. But Ilara did not push. She simply sat in the chair Cale had padded for her and began to draw the letters of the alphabet, her voice soft as she explained each one. She drew pictures, a bird, a flower, the forged hammer, and wrote the words beneath them. Lyra would watch from a distance, her dark eyes absorbing every movement. Days turned into a week, and the child's circle of observation grew smaller. One afternoon, she crept forward and, with a trembling hand, took the chalk from Ilara's fingers. She didn't write a letter, but drew a small, wobbly heart next to Ilara's drawing of a flower. Ilara's own heart clenched. It was the first bridge thrown across the chasm of the child's silence, a communication more profound than any spoken word. As she worked with the girl, a quiet rhythm established itself in the small cottage. The percussive song of Cale's hammer from the smithy became the day's punctuation, a steady, reassuring beat that underscored the quiet scratching of chalk on slate. One evening, as a cold rain lashed against the cottage single window, the unspoken histories that haunted the small home began to surface. Lyra was asleep, tucked into her small bed in the corner of the main room. Cale was mending a leather strap, his large hands surprisingly deft. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but comfortable, filled with the soft sounds of the rain and their own breathing. The horse was named Zephyr, Ilara said suddenly, her voice low. Cale stopped his work, looking at her. He spooked at a snake on the path. It was no one's fault. Not even his. She stared at her own hands, lying still in her lap. When I woke up, the world had shrunk to the size of my bed. My father visited me once. He looked at my legs as if they had personally betrayed him. After that, he sent servants. Cale put down the strap. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. Anya loved the rain, he said, his eyes distant. She said it washed the world clean. It was a fever. It came on fast. The healer said it was her lungs. By the end, she couldn't draw a full breath. He looked over at his sleeping daughter. Lyra held her hand. She felt it go cold. The silence started then. A wall she built to keep the memory out. Or perhaps, to keep her mother inside. They sat there for a long time, the rain drumming against the roof, two solitary islands of pain, suddenly realizing they were part of the same archipelago, their shores of grief washed by the same tide of loss. The bond between them deepened, not in grand pronouncements, but in the small, unspoken gestures of daily life. He began to leave a small, wild blossom on the tray with her morning meal. She, in turn, began to save a portion of the stew for him, keeping it warm by the fire for when he finished his long hours at the forge, his body weary. Lyra was their constant, silent go-between. She would bring one of Ilara's books to Cale, pointing at a picture, and he would explain what it was, his deep voice a gentle murmur. Then she would take the book back to Ilara, as if sharing her father's words. They were a strange, fractured family, stitched together with sorrow and the tentative threads of a new, unspoken affection. The true test of this fragile bond came with the first snow of winter. A blizzard descended upon the village, a howling vortex of wind and ice. In the middle of the night, a loud crack echoed through the cottage. A main support beam in the smithy, heavy with snow, had split. Icy wind and snow blasted into the workshop, threatening to collapse the roof over their living quarters. Cale rushed out, his face grim. Ilara, watching from the doorway, her heart pounding, saw him struggling to brace the beam with a length of timber. It won't hold, she called out over the wind shriek. The angle is wrong. You need to create a triangle, to distribute the load. Her tutors had insisted on lessons in engineering and architecture, calling it essential knowledge for a noblewoman who might one day manage an estate. She had thought it useless. Now, she shouted instructions, her voice clear and certain, describing how to place a second brace to form a truss. Cale, trusting her completely, followed her words. The groaning of the roof lessened. He worked for an hour, securing the structure, before coming back inside, his hair and shoulders white with snow. He came straight to her, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. "Thank you," he breathed. He reached out and brushed a stray snowflake from her cheek, his calloused thumb impossibly gentle against her skin. The touch was electric, a spark of heat in the frozen night, an acknowledgement of a partnership that went far beyond teacher and rescuer. It was a touch that spoke of equals. Word of the disgraced lady living with the town blacksmith eventually slithered its way back to the castle. Lord Valerus was incensed. The girl was supposed to be miserable, a cautionary tale. Instead, she was finding a life, a purpose, in the dirt and smoke of the common world. It was an insult to his authority. His retaliation was swift and cruel. He passed a decree, levying a new lord's tax on any work commissioned from the town smith, effectively pricing Kale out of business. The villagers, fearful of their lord's wrath, began to shun the little cottage. Orders dried up. The fire in the forge, once the beating heart of their home, grew cold. The stares they received in the village were sharp with suspicion and fear. They were isolated, an island once more, but this time, they were on it together. The final blow came in the form of a summons. A guard hammered on their door, demanding they present themselves at the castle. Lord Valerus meant to finish what he had started, to publicly shame them and force Ilara into the silent, hidden life of a convent. Kale carried her into the great hall, the same hall where she had once danced. Her father sat upon his high seat like a vulture on a throne, his face a mask of cold fury. "So," he began, his voice dripping with contempt. "The broken toy has found a new playmate in the dirt. I have been lenient. But this farce ends now. She will be given to the Silent Sisters, to pray for her wretched soul. And you, Smith, will be fortunate to leave this town with your life." Kale stood tall, his hand resting protectively on Ilara's shoulder, but it was Ilara who spoke. Her voice, no longer a whisper, rang out with the clear, cutting authority of her birthright, now tempered with the steel of her newfound strength. "You speak of farce, father," she said, her eyes locking with his. "The only farce here is a lord who mistakes cruelty for strength and trades his own blood for wine. This man's home, which you call dirt, has more honor in one of its floorboards than in this entire castle. He gave me a purpose. You gave me a price tag." Valerus was stunned into silence, his face purpling with rage. He had expected a weeping, broken girl. He was met with a queen. They returned to the cottage, the weight of the lord's threat hanging over them like a shroud. The larder was nearly empty. The forge was cold and silent. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the defiant, terrifying love that had grown between them. That night, sitting in the flickering firelight, the reality of their ruin settled in. It was in this moment of absolute despair that the final walls crumbled. "He will not stop until we are destroyed," Kale said, his voice raw with defeat. He looked at her, his face a landscape of anguish. "I have brought this upon you. I tried to save you, and I have only led you to a different cage." Ilara reached out and took his hand, her slender fingers lacing with his strong, calloused ones. "No," she said, her voice firm. "You did not cage me. You gave me the sky." She saw the truth of her own heart then, clear and undeniable. "In my father's castle, I was an object, defined by what I had lost. Here I am simply Ilara." Kale knelt before her chair, his gaze full of a reverence she had never known. "To me," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears, "you are not simply Ilara. You are the fire in a cold house. You are the song in the silence. I love you." A tear finally escaped her eye, tracing a path down her cheek. "And I love you, Kale," she confessed. More than I ever knew it was possible to love. Their love, confessed in the heart of their shared ruin, became their last and greatest act of rebellion. In the quiet hours that followed their confession, a memory sparked in Ilara's mind, a relic from her days of tedious study. "The town charter," she whispered, her eyes wide with sudden inspiration. "Father kept all the old municipal documents in the library. I remember reading the original town charter, granted by the king 2 centuries ago. It guaranteed the guild's protection from arbitrary taxation by the local lord." She looked at Kale, the flicker of a plan igniting in her gaze. He is not just being cruel, he is being illegal. His greed has made him careless. Hope, fierce and sharp, pierced the gloom. The next day, Cale, armed with Ilara's knowledge, went not to the guild masters, but to the oldest craftsmen, the men who remembered the stories of their grandfathers. He spoke of the old charter, of their rights. At first they were skeptical, afraid. But then he spoke of Ilara, of her courage and her sharp mind, and of the injustice done to them all. A retired carpenter, a man respected by all, listened intently and then nodded slowly. "The Lord has grown too comfortable in his power," he declared. "It is time he was reminded that his authority rests upon our consent." Slowly, cautiously, the community began to turn. They had seen Cale's honor and Ilara's quiet dignity. They had seen the Lord's petty cruelty. The seeds of rebellion began to sprout in the frozen ground. The confrontation took place in the market square, the heart of the village. Lord Valerus arrived on his warhorse, flanked by guards, expecting to intimidate a few grumbling peasants. He found the entire town assembled, silent and watchful. Cale stood at the front of the crowd, and beside him, in her chair, sat Ilara, holding a scroll. It was not the original charter, but a copy she had painstakingly recreated from memory, every clause, every seal, every article rendered in her perfect, scholarly hand. When her father began to bellow threats, Ilara raised her hand. "There is no need for threats, my lord," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "There is only a need to honor the law." She began to read from the scroll, her voice calm and unwavering. She cited the exact articles that forbade punitive taxes, that guaranteed the guild's right to fair trade. She laid out, with irrefutable logic and clarity, how Lord Valerus had systematically violated the very foundation of his own authority for personal gain. It was not a battle of swords, but of words, and her words were sharper than any blade. The townspeople murmured, the sound growing from a whisper to a roar of angry agreement. The truth, once spoken, was undeniable. Defeated by a piece of paper and the daughter he had discarded, Lord Valerus was stripped of his power. He was not imprisoned or exiled, but something far worse for a man like him, he was rendered irrelevant. Faced with a unified petition to the king, he was forced to rescind his taxes and repay what he had stolen. His authority was broken, his pride shattered. He was left to pace the cold halls of his castle, a ghost in his own life, a perfect mirror of the fate he had designed for Ilara. Back at the cottage, life began anew. The forge roared back to life, its fiery heart beating strong once more. The orders returned, now accompanied by gifts of bread, cheese, and respect from the villagers who now saw Ilara not as a disgraced noble, but as their champion. They had not sought a kingdom of stone and gold, but had built one of wood, iron, and love. Their little home was no longer a fragile shelter, but a fortress. That evening, the three of them sat by the fire. Ilara was reading a story to Lyra from one of her old books, her voice a soft melody in the warm room. Cale sat nearby, polishing his finest hammer, his gaze soft as it rested on his wife and daughter. Lyra, who had been watching them with an unnerving intensity all day, suddenly reached out her small hand. She gently touched Ilara's cheek, then leaned over and touched Cale's hand. Her gaze moved between the two of them, a look of profound understanding in her dark, intelligent eyes. She looked at Ilara, who had taught her to see the world in words, and then at Cale, who had shown her what quiet strength meant. A small sound, a broken, rusty noise, escaped her lips. She tried again, her small face screwed up with effort. And then, clear as a tiny bell in the quiet room, a word fell into the air. "Mama." She was looking at Ilara. Ilara's breath hitched, and tears streamed freely down her face. Cale dropped his hammer with a soft thud, his own eyes shining. Lyra then turned her gaze to him, a radiant smile breaking across her face, and spoke the second word she had found. "Papa." It was more than a new beginning, it was a resurrection. A family, broken by tragedy and tyranny, had been forged whole again, not by noble blood or grand destiny, but by the relentless, quiet power of a love that saw worth where the world saw none. True nobility, they had discovered, was not a title you were born with, but a kingdom you built in the hearts of others.